Hello, everyone, and welcome to another history lesson with me, Miss Warren. Today we are going to cover the aftermath of World War One and the Russian Revolution. So we get to talk a little bit about the Romanovs for a moment in time. So let's just jump into it, shall we? So, at the end of World War One, after all of this chaos has happened, we talk a little bit about the Spanish, excuse me, the Spanish influenza and how it did help create this opportunity for the Allied powers to force Germany into peace. Now, there was a little bit of a rumor that Germany was already looking to, wave the white flag, but by the time it was all said and done, the Allied powers that had two waves of the Spanish flu hit them, but Germany was having their second wave at the end of the war, and they didn't have any men because they were fighting a war on two fronts. So they finally came to an armistice, or they came to an agreement to lay down their arms. So their peace treaty came at the Paris Peace Conference. Now, on the Allied side, you had Woodrow Wilson from the US, George Clemenceau from France, you had Lord George from Great Britain, and Orlando from Italy. And they all met with other world leaders to discuss what they were going to do with Germany. Now, you would think that if they were having a peace conference, that Germany would also be included because they're, the ones being punished. But Germany was the only country who was not invited to the peace conference. Now, Wilson went into this peace conference going, yeah, the United States came in and we won this war for you. So he came in with a 14-point plan on how to keep and maintain peace. And two of those points, the only two that would be recognized by any of the other leaders, were the League of Nations in order to keep the peace, establish the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the model or to the United Nations, and then two, self-determination. This was where each ethnic group had their own government. Each country was able to self-determine how they want to lead. Other leaders, all they wanted, especially France and Great Britain, all they wanted was for someone to pay for the war. And who do you think they went after? They went after Germany. And they went after Germany pretty hardcore. So in the Treaty of Versailles, I know, right? Germany, the Allied powers, aka Great Britain and France, would force Germany to take full and sole responsibility for the war. This is actually a clause in the Treaty of Versailles, and it's called the War Guilt Clause. As a result of them taking full responsibility for the war, they had to pay huge reparations to the Allies, specifically to France and Great Britain, to help pay for the rebuilding of everything. They also had to promise to demilitarize or to shrink their army. Their army could have no more than 100,000 soldiers, no more than 1,000 commanders. Can you imagine that? Ugh. They also had to agree to no Air Force whatsoever, and they had to agree to a small navy, but no U-boats. They could, what's the point of having a navy if you can't have any ships? Whatever. The treaty was a huge insult to Germany. Huge. There were many people who felt it unfair, especially Hitler. Hitler became one of the most vocal opponents to the Treaty of Versailles and to also what Great Britain and France were forcing upon Germany. So this paved the way for Hitler to come to power. Only part of Wilson's 14-point plan would actually be put into power or put into play, and that was the League of Nations. And it was kind of ironic because the US Congress refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles or to join the League. So what was the point of the US even showing up? whatever. So the one thing that Wilson wanted more than anything else was the League of Nations, and the United States wasn't even involved in it. So you can see where this is going to go. Doesn't work out very well. Doesn't work out at all, actually. So reparations, Germany had to pay $55 million in reparations. Billion. Yeah, like there's no way that they could have paid that because one, a part of the reparations was they had to give up the region of Alsace-Lorraine to France. And so that basically meant that all of Germany's income was taken away. So they had no way of supporting themselves because they couldn't export, they didn't have any money to import. So what the heck were they going to do? And their largest employer could no longer employ anybody. If you didn't know that, the largest employer is typically the military in a country. So this is Alsace-Lorraine. This is one thing that has been, fought over between France and Germany forever and a freaking day. And this was given to France. This was also the land that had a lot of the coal fields, a lot of natural resources that would give, a boost in the economy. They also lost a portion of the land to Poland and also Denmark. So basically, if you remember back to the end of Napoleon, we talked about this with nationalism and imperialism, everything that they had gained, they not lost. You can see how Germany would be upset with this, right? So after the end of World War I, the map of Europe would totally be redrawn again. The old empires would disappear and new countries would be created or recreated. This also created mandates or territories that were helped by European powers. And then in 1917, you had what's called the Balfour Declaration. This is when Great Britain would formally announce its in favor of creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine, aka Israel today. And this would be very problematic because in Palestine, for hundreds of years, the inhabitants would be Arab. But this is land that is controlled by Great Britain. So they were like, yeah, we control it, so we can give it to whoever we want, right? Great Britain. Europeans do some really dumb things, y'all. Now, I told you all that one of the things this war would be known as is the Lost Generation War. The human cost in World War I was exponential. You had over 43 million men, women, children killed, wounded, or captured. There was no way that you could go back to a normal life because people who lived remember seeing their friends and fellow soldiers be blown up or shot to death. So it was hard to come back from this. France and Belgium and Germany were so badly damaged during the war economically that it was hard for them to rebound. And then things would get much worse for Germany. This left huge voids in political power in these countries. People did not trust the governments and they felt disillusioned, especially Germany. It was so sad. So the Balfour Declaration becomes not so much important now, but it would become hugely important at the end of World War II and the end of the Holocaust. In 1917, as I was saying, it was officially when Great Britain took a stance on being in favor of reconstituting Palestine as the national home of the Jewish people. This was not legally binding in any way, shape, or form. It was just their formal support. So there was still this movement, the Zionist movement, to force Europeans to really take action. Because this document didn't do anything. It didn't force action in any way, shape, or form. So In Palestine, before World War I and the Balfour Declaration, 86% of the population in Palestine was Muslim. Only 4% was Jewish. Now, I feel like there was a better way to integrate the area, but, Britain completely blew that to pieces. And we'll talk way more about it later. Okay, so if we go back and we look at World War I, we notice that as Russia leaves, the US comes in. Well, what the heck? Why does Russia leave? Russia leaves because they were experiencing a lot of domestic problems with their people. After 3.5 years of fighting in World War I, Russia just leaves. And there's a reason for that. This is where people get kind of smart, all right? Germany actually pays for Stalin and Lenin to go into Russia to, start a revolution. Lenin and Stalin go back to Russia to start a revolution. Now, before this, Lenin was, exiled for trying to create problems. Well, Germany during World War I paid Lenin and smuggled Lenin back into Russia so that he could start a revolution. And guess what? It worked pretty well. So the background of the revolution is that there was some short-term problems that were not addressed. There were no good military commanders. Tsar Nicholas led the armies in World War I, which was a huge mistake because he had no experience. The soldiers were not well trained at all. They had very few weapons and a lot of casualties because of it. And then industry in Russia couldn't keep up with European weapons. They had a lot of outdated equipment. There also started to emerge a lot of distrust in leadership. So Caesarina Alexandra, who was German by birth, was already not trusted by the Russian people. They thought she was a spy, especially when World War II, cropped up. But she was left in charge. When Nicholas went off to fight in the troops and lead the troops, she was the one left in charge. And not to mention, she was so lacking in something that she trusted a man by the name of Rasputin to be her advisor and confidant. And so she leaned on him to help make decisions, and she made those decisions on some really terrible advice, not device. Rasputin was so-called medicine man who is eventually killed by nobles in 1916 because everybody around Caesarina Alexandra and Tsar Nicholas could see Rasputin for what he was, which is, a fraud. Now in 1917, Russia would also come to a huge food shortage. So there would be a protest in Petrograd and St. Petersburg, and this would be a countrywide strike. They wanted peace and they wanted bread. Soldiers wouldn't take action against the people because the government essentially had no power. And, as a result of this, rebellion, the Tsar disbands the Duma. And the Duma ignores the Tsar along with the soldiers and the citizens. So this really shows that the Tsar has no power. So just a few short days after this protest happened, the Duma declared a new government and that demanded Nicholas II abdicate the throne. So based on the old Russian calendar, this is known as the February Revolution. So this is Rasputin, and this is the royal family. So this is Tsar Nicholas II, and this is Caesarina Alexandra. This is Alexei. The reason why Caesarina Alexandra trusted Rasputin is because Rasputin healed Alexei. There was no healing Alexei. Alexei had the disease that he was a hemophiliac. So it's present in a lot of European royals because they are all related. And once you are all related and there's no mixing of new blood, you start to see genetic disorders. And hemophilia is one of them. And hemophilia presents itself in mostly men. And it means that if you get a cut, your blood doesn't clot to stop the bleeding. So Alexei, a paper cut could have killed Alexei, but Alexei got a much worse face, just saying. There was a provisional government that was put in place after Nicholas II abdicates. So Nicholas II abdicates, and then his brother abdicates the following day because he's like, I don't want anything to do with it. So this provisional government was led by Alexander Khmelnytsky, and he was actually, fighting in World War I for Russia's honor. And this is where the term Soviet would come into play. Councils of workers and soldiers would actually challenge Krasinski's government for authority. So after, the Duma sets up a new government and forces the Tsar to abdicate, even the provisional government is not trusted. So this is where you have the rise of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. So the Bolsheviks were a socialist group led by Vladimir Lenin, who was dedicated to an extremely violent revolution. And guess what? He got it. He actually believed that Karl Marx said that the proletariat would rise in revolt against the bourgeoisie. So the proletariat is the working class, and the bourgeoisie is, the ruling class, the wealthy class. Lenin, as I said, was exiled from 1900 to 1917, and Germans paid for Lenin to go back to Russia because they were hoping that it would weaken Russian unity and lead to a revolution, and it totally did. Lenin's slogan was peace, land, and bread, and it totally won out here. So this is the Communist Party of Soviet Russia under Lenin and the Bolsheviks. So in November of 1917, this is known as the October Revolution because of the Russian calendar, the old one, the Bolsheviks would seize the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, or then it was Petrograd. And the provisional government under Krasinski would totally collapse, and Lenin would take power. He would then take ownership of all the land and make it illegal to own private property. Done. The government now owns everything. In March of 1918, there would be the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and this would be where Russia would officially withdraw from World War I. Russia loses land to the Central Powers, which will become utterly humiliating, but it got them out of the war. Them losing the land, however, meant they also lost natural resources. So peace was still this elusive creature because the country sank into civil war. It was totally bad. So let's talk a little bit about the Civil War and the October Revolution. So you had the Bolsheviks, the communist forces that were called the Reds, and on the other side of that, the anti-communist forces, which were the Whites. The Whites would be the army leaders, the wealthy Russians, the political opponents, the landowners. You see where I'm going? You have the poor people on one side and the rich people on the other, right? The Allies actually worried. So the Allies in World War I actually worried about the communists. So they began to supply the Whites with whatever they needed. And the Reds actually questioned the patriotism of the Whites because if you were taking aid and supplies from the Allies, then how Russian are you exactly? It actually worked because in July of 1918, the Reds killed Tsar Nicholas and his wife and the entire family. We're going to talk about the story of Anastasia, but this is where it comes from. And this is some images of what the Civil War looked like in Russia. So the communists triumphed. The Red Army was much more superior than the Whites because they were better trained by Leon Trotsky. because he demanded rigid discipline. The whites had no common goal, and the reds were unified in one common goal and purpose. So the reds set up war communism. So they had a central government that controlled all foods, banks, factories, literally everything. And the Reds would create a secret police to get rid of anyone who opposed communists. This was called the Red Terror. The secret police would be the KGB. I know some of you have watched things that talked about the KGB, and that's where this would come into play. So once the communists were able to completely control Russia by 1921, they became very hostile to the Allies who had tried to keep communists out of power. Literally nobody trusted anybody anymore. Nobody. But here's the downside of communism. The economy still wasn't going very well. So Lenin instituted what's called the new economic policy to help. So the peasants could sell food for a profit. This allows for some capitalism within the economy. And it also tried to encourage food production, so the growth of food. But in 1924, Lenin would die of a stroke. So there became a power struggle between Trotsky and Stalin. Now, for all of you who's out there thinking that Lenin was a pretty bad guy, Lenin was a saint compared to Stalin, and eventually Stalin would win out the war with Trotsky. I'm not even going to begin to pronounce Stalin's real name because I can't even. Joseph, however, is the English version of his Russian name. Now, Stalin in Russian actually means steel. So he is Joseph Steel in Russian. He made himself into a man of steel, literally, in nickname, but also in his name, translation. Stalin would not be a good dude. And we're going to talk more about Stalin when we get to, the interwar years in World War II. So that's it for today. I'll see you in class. Bye, everyone.